بسم الله الأمن الأقدس اللهم صل على نقطة البيان ومن آمن به بعزة وجلال. A spectre is haunting Anglo-Europa, the spectre of Marxism. All the powers of contemporary Anglo-Europa and Russia have entered into an unholy alliance to exorcise this spectre. President and Chancellor, Trump and Putin, French Neo-Liberals and German Centre-Rightists. Now, an even bigger spectre haunts Baha'o-Zionism, the spectre of Bābism. The USJ and the colonial settler state of Zionistan have been in an unholy alliance since before 1948, attempting to exorcise the spectre lest their malevolent influence and infiltration strategies within MENA, not to mention the flow of their tourism shekels to the Mountain of Doom, dries up. Because if it ever gets out that the final remains of the Bāb are not actually buried on Mount Carmel, and that the original Bābī movement, the post-Islamic religion of the Bayān, is alive and well and has never had anything to do with Bahā'īsm, then it is game over for the meglomaniacal hanging gardens of Babylon, Haifa-Disney theme park atop Mount Carmel, together with its benefactors with their ill-gotten wealth extracted from false advertising, colonial expropriation, ethnic cleansing, and outright theft. This podcast is a response, basically, to Dale Husband's little silly video that he made last month in December, called Update About Wahid Azal. I'll actually put a link to that video in the description box of this one. I wanted to address the fact that Mr. Dale Husband actually reveals himself to be a reactionary with his red baiting and anti-Marxist canards. Now, Mr. Dale Husband claims to be a liberal American. And his liberalism, however, is a species of Dixiocrat, that is Southern Democrat liberalism. And evidence for this is the fact that last year, back in the middle of last year, Mr. Dale Husband was referring to African Americans as quote-unquote colored people, using the exact same diction and reference points as the era of segregation and Jim Crow. Now, he's gone on for the last couple of months, trying to prove himself to be, an inclusive, white liberal, etc., etc. However, the tail of the proverbial rooster shows itself in Mr. Dale Husband's red baiting and anti-Marxist canards. And this is very interesting to me, is that within the liberal wing of the American Democratic Party that Mr. Dale Husband claims to belong to, in the eastern part of the United States and also in some of the Midwest states like Michigan, etc., a lot of these left-wing liberals who belong to the greater umbrella that is the Democratic Party of the United States, especially a lot of the Bernie Sanders supporters, these people would describe themselves either as outright Marxists or quasi-Marxists of one shape or another. But Mr. Dale Husband, being a Confederate Texan, hailing from a Southern Baptist background, basically shows his hand and the outright reactionary and far-right nature of his greater political ideology when he engages in this red-baiting anti-Marxist nonsense. Now, I have no problems in being described as a Marxist. I have no problems with Karl Marx. Karl Marx has been a fundamental influence, a formative figure of my intellectual development going back to when I was 15 years old when I first read the Communist Manifesto. That doesn't mean that I am a classic Marxist or even a Marxist-Leninist. In fact, I am not a Marxist-Leninist by any definition of the word. I accept the very basics, theoretical arguments that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels present in texts such as Das Kapital, which is the real magnum opus of the theoretical magnum opus of Marxism, of classical Marxism. And I believe that it behooves any person who truly wants to understand the nature of the capitalist system, who wants to get into the nitty-gritty and the meat of capitalist ontology, it behooves them to actually pore over the text of Das Kapital and understand the arguments that are being presented, particularly in the first half of the book where the theory of value is presented. It is a very complex argument that Karl Marx presents. Nevertheless, this complex argument is true and can be demonstrated. That doesn't mean that from the time that Karl Marx wrote this text, Karl Marx and Engels wrote Das Kapital, that we haven't had an evolution in the nature of this beast called capitalism. And neoliberalism is a completely different kind of beast, a much more bloated beast than the one that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were writing about. Nevertheless, excuse me, in order to even understand the neoliberal capitalist beast, one must delve into at least the first volume of Das Kapital. And without it, it just doesn't, what is really going on in the world, why this system behaves this way, is not properly understood. Now, as I mentioned, I am not a Marxist-Leninist. I don't have much regard for Vladimir Lenin. I have read the collected works of Vladimir Lenin in their English translation many years ago, over 20 plus years ago. I went through all of those volumes. I think it's over 20 volumes. And I am not a committed Leninist. I look at Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov Lenin in the same light I look at Mirza Hossein Ali Nari Baha'o-Shaitan, the founder of Bahā'īsm. So I tend to look at the trajectory of the history of Marxism in its Marxist-Leninist angle and trajectory, pretty much in the same way that I look at the overall history of Bābism. I look at Leninism as a rupture into the classical Marxism of Marx and Engels. And during the very first months and years after the Bolshevik Revolution, a great German Marxist, the great woman, German woman, Rosa Luxemburg, also put her finger on the flaws, the fundamental flawed nature of the Leninist democratic centralist model that, in my belief, corrupted Marxism and corrupted the revolutionary impetus and impulse that Marxism represented. Because obviously, Leninism, in its either its Trotskyist manifestation or later in its Stalinist manifestation, are in essence, have gone in directions that, where Marx and Engels are literally rolling in their graves. Not only is the proletarian revolution, the peasants' revolution, that far into the horizon, given these two aberrations or deviations, as I would call them, but it essentially gave the argument away to the enemies of socialism throughout the world. And Trotskyists, for their part, are basically, Marxists for the system these days. Whereas the Leninists, are still inhabiting a space from a bygone era and have not been able to novelize themselves beyond the problems that was introduced initially by Vladimir Lenin and then, propagated and prolonged by the Soviet state and also the Chinese and other states. However, there are other models of Marxism. And one contemporary model of Marxism that I think is extremely inspiring for indigenous movements throughout the world is the Zapatistas of Mexico. These are primarily Mayans. They are believers. They practice indigenous Mayan spirituality. But by the same token, they are revolutionary socialists / anarcho, syndicalist, and even libertarians. It's very difficult to pin down the full spectrum of the ideology of the Zapatistas. But nevertheless, this is where they're coming from. And I think these people are extremely important to look at. Another model of Marxism that I find extremely important is this perspective of pedagogy. And this pedagogy that I'm talking about is primarily stemming from the work of people, of Brazilians such as Paulo Freire. His Pedagogy of the Oppressed is a very, very important book because of the praxis that it lays down. Other Marxian figures from the Third Worldist movement of the 1960s would obviously be Frantz Fanon. Now, Frantz Fanon, would have described himself as a Marxist-Leninist, but in essence, many of the arguments put forth by Fanon went way beyond Lenin. And in some sense, it articulates an indigenized form of a classical Marxism in certain key arguments that he put forward, especially in his Wretched of the Earth. So these are the models of Marxism that we're talking about. Then there are the Latin American liberation theologians and Latin American theology in general. which made quite a stir during the 1980s because the Sandinista government of Daniel Ortega and many of the ministers of that government came from that milieu of liberation theology. Many of these people were subsequently declared to be apostates by the Catholic Church because there was a lot of priests and Catholic parishioners amongst these liberation theologians. Yet what they did is that they combined the perspectives of Scripture with Marxian analysis. So this is the space, the Marxian space that the Fatimiyya Sufi order and myself specifically are coming from. We are not classical Marxists in that sense. We're definitely not Leninists. And fundamentally, we reject, at least in its very crude form, dialectical materialism. We don't reject dialectics, the dialectical method, but the materialism of dialectical materialism, I believe, from a methodological and a meta-historical perspective, is a fundamentally flawed perspective to look at the world. And that is because it is merely locked into the events of the material world itself, and is incapable of even acceding to an axiom of forces beyond the apparently material. And this is where the flaw of dialectical materialism emerges from. And incidentally, many people have pointed out that Marx's own argument about the labor theory of value actually defies the methodology of the materialism of dialectical materialism. And there's been a lot of debate amongst Marxist theoreticians and theorists over the last 100 years over this issue. So dialectical materialism as a flawed ideology does not, however, negate the fact that Karl Marx, particularly in that first volume of Das Kapital, is fundamentally right, that his arguments and the perspective that he lays out continues to be relevant to this very day, and that it behooves people who want to unpack and want to deconstruct the toxic system that is the system of global neoliberal capitalism to understand, read, and study these arguments. Otherwise, you really don't know what you're talking about. That doesn't mean that Marx is the final word on these issues. But nevertheless, the theories and the arguments and the dialectics that is put into this text must be taken on by any person who wants to understand what is going on. Furthermore, the Bayān itself maintains a dialectic, a very, very important and explicit dialectic throughout the entirety of the text, an argument that runs from the first page to the last, to the 19th unity of the 11th Wahid or 11th chapter of the Bayān. And this dialectic, without understanding it, one can be very misled by what the Bayān is saying. And that is, the dialectic is introduced by the primal point himself, and that is the dialectic between fire and light. Another way of putting this is the dialectic between the forces of the acosmic ignorance, the jah, and the hyro-intelligence or nexal consciousness, the aql. This is the dialectic that occurs throughout the entirety of the text of the Bayān. There's a kind of a quasi-Zoroastrian thing going on here, obviously, but nevertheless, the way that the Bāb applies this of the unfolding within historical time, within the spatio-temporal world, the unfolding between, and the dialectic and the conflict between fire and light, nar wa nur, is one that resonates very closely with the kind of dialectic that Marxism is talking about in another context. So if we are as Bābīs, as Bayānis, we are taking on board this fundamental argument between fire and light, which in another context by the Bāb is rephrased as being the conflict between negation and affirmation. Then therefore, when we delve in, when our arguments, our perspectives become more nuanced, then it is obvious that we will resonate with a theory and a praxis that is Marxism. That doesn't make us strictly Marxists, but that makes us adept at certain ways of intellectualizing certain issues in the greater world. Mr. Dale Husband, as a liberal, unfortunately, is a product of a society that has been brainwashed, especially since the 1950s, and specifically in the South, in the Confederate States, which Texas is, to look at any manifestation of Marxism as something bad. The amount of propaganda and brainwashing that has occurred amongst Americans, white Americans specifically, to this very day, I would argue, is the reason why this inequality and just social stupidity and total myopia amongst great cross sections of the American electorate occurs. Nevertheless, Marxism itself played a very fundamental role during the 1960s countercultural movement. Whether we're talking about groups like the Black Panthers or the American Indian movement, individuals who I actually used to know back in New Mexico, or if we're talking about, outright Marxist-Leninist organizations like SDS, Students for Democratic Society, or the Weathermen, and on and on and on these examples go, the role that Marxism played in this counterculture movement of the 1960s that came very close with the moratorium movement against the Vietnam War to actually taking the entire system down. Nobody has come that close before and since. Not even Occupy Wall Street came that close in the late 1960s to take that system, that malevolent war machine down. So, I mean, in Mr. Dale Husband's opinion, all of this is bad because, obviously he is a dixiocrat. He comes from that whole tradition of Southern liberalism, which is, really no different than the conservatism of the Republican Party. These people may have taken on the gay lesbian cause, but ultimately, they have taken aboard this cause because these individuals have been progressively, absorbed by the establishment itself. Look at Dale Husband's, support during the 2016 elections of Hillary Clinton, one of the greatest warmongers of contemporary times. This is the woman who illegally, under that whole NATO attack on Libya, when Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya, was captured and executed, is known to have said, and they recorded this, we came, we saw, and he died. Something that under all international law qualifies this woman as a war criminal, because that entire basis of that NATO, intervention, this so-called humanitarian intervention into Libya, was completely illegal. It has since been proven to be an outright lie, and especially one of the biggest cheerleaders of that whole escapade by the United States, namely one Ricardo Ian Cole of the University of Michigan, who was on that so-called Democracy Now! And also PBS, etc., constantly cheerleading for an American intervention into Libya that has literally destroyed that country now, turned it into a failed state, and brought back literal slavery into that country. This is the kind of stuff that this idiot Dale Husband supports, and it is his anti-Marxism, it is his red baiting, and his dixiocratic, pseudo-liberalism of the South, of the Confederate South, as a white ex-Southern Baptist who's now part of this, 12-step program with turned into a religion known as Unitarian Universalists. This is where this red baiting, this is where this anti-Marxism comes from. And just let's remember, it was Democrats like Mr. Dale Husband who were at the forefront of helping people like Eugene McCarthy during the McCarthy era in the U.S. Congress during the early 1950s. So this should tell us what an absolute jerk of an individual this Dale Husband is. I want to address something here. It has been brought to my attention that this latest edition of Baha'i Pajuhi that was published in Iran recently, all devoted to Mr. Dale Husband, in it, Mr. Dale Husband has made some very fallacious claims about himself. It has been written that Dale Husband is a widely published author. What has Mr. Dale Husband published? What papers has he published? Even ones that he hasn't, technically published in journal. Does he have an academia edu page where he's uploaded these papers? He has made this claim. This claim is false. Mr. Dale Husband is not a widely published author. He has not. The only thing he has published is his blog, rants that he continually puts on his blog. Then it has been claimed that he is a widely respected peace and anti-war activist. Where? In Texas? Nobody knows Mr. Dale Husband in any of the anti-war and peace, pro-peace circles that I am familiar with in the United States. So this is a lie. Mr. Dale Husband or someone on his behalf, even perhaps the editors of this Baha'i Pajhuhi, have introduced these fallacious arguments into Persian language print about Dale Husband in order to elevate the status of this guy. But these are all lies. Dale Husband is just a character with a single blog that I believe is a gatekeeper put up by the Baha'i Internet Agency and the Baha'i powers that be in order to control the discourse of ex-Baha'is online. This guy is a Trojan horse. And it's as simple as that. And he has given himself away again and again and again and again. And the evidence keeps mounting and other people keep seeing it and pointing out to him that he's a jerk. Now, he mentions in this video of his that I am, that I am a cult leader. Okay, Mr. Dale Husband, why don't you tell your friends then, ask your friends to make up their minds. I am either a cult leader or I am a failed cult leader. I cannot be a cult leader and a failed cult leader at the same time. There's a contradiction in this argument. Either, I represent a cult, right, where I am always right, or I am failed at that endeavor and therefore your argument evaporates into thin air. You need to make up your mind based on the talking points that these criminals that you have allied yourself with, namely Nate Abu Kira and Dennis Giron, tell you. So, you are a fool, Mr. Dale Husband. And you are a racist, white supremacist, Dixiecrat, pseudo-liberal, whatever gay lesbian cause that you support. The gay lesbian cause, as I've mentioned, has been appropriated by the establishment. And when you're talking about LGBT people, you're talking about middle-class white and primarily male homosexuals. White male homosexuals, not even black male homosexuals, but your support is mainly for the white male homosexual, which, God knows, perhaps you are also included in that subcategory. Not that it really matters. But the fact of the matter is that your anti-Marxism, your red baiting proves to any person that listens to that rant of yours on that video that you are a reactionary, Dixiecrat, pseudo-liberal, and you're not for real. And that is the way it is. La hujja ila aliyan qabla nabil.